Okay, welcome back. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to go back to the beginning of the story, and this time rather than looking at some of the significant events and people or hideous creatures that Christian had to face along the way, now what I want to do is take a look at the book in describing the path or the journey itself. And Bunyan is basically using what Jesus said as the theme of this book, that we have to follow the straight and narrow path, and we have to avoid the wide path that leads to destruction. So keeping on the straight and narrow way is the key that will lead the Christian pilgrim all the way to heaven. And if you get off the straight and narrow way, you are entering the pathway that leads to destruction, and it's really dangerous. But the biggest difference is the path that leads to destruction always looks easier. It always, at least initially, it always looks easier, but then it destroys you. Whereas the way that Jesus set for us, it's more difficult and it looks more challenging. And so Bunyan is going to talk about Jesus, who is the Lord of the celestial city, or the Lord of the hill, or the King. And He is the way, the truth, and the life. And He has so charted the path. And so the Christian life is not always easy. But as we'll see, along the way, when it's most difficult, the Lord provides escape and the Lord provides help. And so fleeing from the city of destruction and immediately the way through the swamp of despair, but then to the wicket gate, and then to that incredible hill is the first journey that Christian takes. But what's interesting is between the wicket gate and the place where the burden of sin falls off Christian, Christian on the way, the pathway now to salvation, makes it to the house of the interpreter. The house of the interpreter. And there are several important lessons, 7 important lessons for Christian in this house. So there's 7 rooms. In each room, there's an important lesson about what it means to stay on the straight and narrow way, the pathway to salvation, the pathway that leads to heaven. And the first room, there's a big portrait of an ominous-looking sort of fellow, not particularly handsome, sort of stern-looking, and that portrait represents who? Me, a pastor. Someone that if you would submit yourself to his authority and leadership, he will teach you the way and he will help guide you. That's what a pastor does. He's a shepherd who, if you will yield to his loving authority, Hebrews 13:17, he will teach you what the way is and he'll provide a guide for you. And so that's the first room. Now the second room is the dusty room. And remember, the person is sweeping up the dust and all his cloud of dust and is choking Christian. He can't hardly breathe. And the dust is all of his sin, right? And you just keep stirring it up. And the dust is, sweeping the dust is like trying to get rid of the sin by way of the what? By the law. And the sweeper of the dust is like Moses, and just stirring it up and stirring it up, because the law can reveal our sin, but the law can never get rid of our sin. So what is needed in order to get rid of the sin was the water of what? Grace. And so, as Christians being choked by his sin, realizing that the law can reveal it, but can never get rid of it, and here comes the water of grace poured out in the room, and it knocks all the dust down, and then they're able to sweep up the room. This is the water of regeneration that is given by the Holy Spirit. And it's a beautiful aspect of our salvation. Grace is what takes it all away. Well, then you get to the third room, is the room of passion, and you got passion and prudence, and the passion represents just the love for the world and the desire for the things of this world. Where prudence represents, if you'll just wait, if you'll just take the narrow path, as difficult as it may be, you'll have more riches in heaven than you'll ever want. So rather than pursuing them now, wait and be willing to go down the path. See, all of the rooms are preparing Christian to go down the straight and narrow path. They're all preparation for that. And prudence or patience says, no, store up your riches in heaven. It's worth it. It may be difficult at times on earth, but it's worth it. Then he goes to the fourth room, which is the fireplace room. And there's a fire that's blazing, but someone's trying to put the fire out. Who's trying to put the fire out? Satan. But the fire won't go out because of what? What's that, Danny? Yeah. Jesus keeps squirting oil on the fire, even though Satan's trying to douse the flame. The fire, once the fire is lit by Christ, cannot be snuffed out. Even though it feels like Satan's going to snuff it out, right? Once that fire is lit, this little light of mine, I'm not going to let Satan snuff it out, right? So Christ keeps it lit, even though Satan tries to snuff it out. There's a promise, right? That once that fire is lit, Christ promises to keep it burning. The fifth room was the palace room. I love this room because it reveals that those who endure life as a Christian will make it into heaven. But there's guards that are trying to keep you from that, right? And what did Christian witness? There was somebody, and what did he do? Danny? Christian saw this guy, and he's like, I don't care, I'm going to make it in, and he charges and he fights off everybody, and he forces his way into heaven. He makes it. What's that story about? It's about really wanting to get to heaven. It's having a real desire to make it. I'm willing to fight off and battle whatever it takes. I'm going to get to heaven. I'm going to fight the good fight. I'm going to finish the race. And even though there are people that are trying to keep me from going there. And then Christian was like, I want to do that right now. And they're like, no, you're not ready yet. So you got to wait. Then two very scary rooms. The sixth room was the caged man room. And what was the problem with the man in the cage? He had lost all hope. He had let his sin so captivate his head and his heart that he had lost all hope. This represents the person that we would say who've become so hardened, their hearts become so hardened that they'll never be able to believe. Is that true? Can that happen? It actually can. It actually can. Some people can become so hardened, their hearts can become so hardened that they'll never believe. And that was a very sad room. And then the final room was the nightmare room. And the nightmare room, what was the nightmare? Anybody remember? Yeah.
So the nightmare room was where a man was sleeping and he wasn't ready for the day of judgment.
He wasn't ready. Remember, Jesus told stories about that. He said, you better be ready. It could come at any time. You better be prepared. Don't be caught sleeping. Remember, in a Pilgrim's Progress, there's a big danger of doing what? Falling asleep. Every time that Christian falls asleep when he's not supposed to, he gets in trouble, right? He's not prepared. Now, other times we'll find Christian is told to sleep and to rest. But that's when he's safe with Jesus. But there are other times, don't fall asleep, stay awake. And so the nightmare room is got to be prepared. So once Christian, he is given all of these instructions, now he's ready to receive salvation and forgiveness. So he makes his way to the cross, and then there's this little hill, and there's a cross, and just below it is an empty tomb. And as he looks to the cross, there goes the burden off his back, and he rolls down the hill into the empty tomb. And then what happens to the burden? Gone forever. Never, ever to be seen again. Isn't it amazing? The burden of sin enters into the tomb, and it vanishes forever. What happened to it? So Jesus takes up the burden and he pays for them, and because of his resurrection, disappear. It's a beautiful story of forgiveness, that the Lord now forgets all of our sins. And as soon as he receives forgiveness, 3 angels show up. They call them shining ones, and they give him 3 gifts. Gift number 1, a declaration. You have been forgiven. Gift number 2, new what? New clothes. Off with those dirty rags, and now you get a new clothes. And what do the clothes represent? Yes, but what else? Righteousness. The filthy rags represent our unrighteousness, and those are taken away, and the new clothes represent righteousness. That's why the New Testament, it says, put off the old man. That's talking about taking off the old clothes and put on Christ. Literally, put on the clothing of Christ's righteousness. And so he was given, and then the last thing was really important. He was given what? He was given a scroll, and he had to keep that scroll close to his heart the whole time. And what did the scroll represent? Assurance of salvation. The scroll represents that you are saved, and here's your assurance. And it is based on your faith that you are going to make it all the way to heaven. And Christian could not lose that, right? He needed that assurance of his salvation throughout his whole journey. Yes?
What would that be for us as we go along our path in doubt?
It's the promise. The scroll is the promise of perseverance. For all who belong to Christ, for everyone that Christ has begun a good work, he will complete it on the day of Christ Jesus. So it's the promise of your perseverance. And what's really important is that we talk about perseverance, not eternal security. There's a big difference between perseverance and eternal security. What's the difference? Yeah, yeah. But eternal, if you just, go ahead. Right. Okay, yeah. But eternal security is, right, eternal security is not enough, right? Eternal security is not fire insurance. So we have to be careful with the language like once saved, always saved. This is your get out of jail free card. Perseverance is a more important concept. Why? It's all about this story. Yeah, perseverance is what keeps you on the path, and perseverance tells us it's going to be difficult. But if you belong to Jesus, it doesn't matter how difficult it will be, you will endure. He who endures to the end will be saved. Those who truly believe are given the promise of that endurance. Now, there's a whole letter in the Bible written about this. What's the letter called? 1 John. 1 John. And there's a sermon in the New Testament that talks a lot about that, and it's called Hebrews. Hebrews was a sermon. And Hebrews talks about it as well. Okay? So, yeah, that's the assurance of Christians' perseverance. And what's going to be interesting, by the way, is one of the things that Christian is going to struggle with is they're going to meet a guy by the name of little faith. Not faithful, but little faith. And little faith makes it to heaven. And then why does little faith make it to heaven? Because what? Yeah, that's all it takes to be saved is faith in Christ. It doesn't matter whether you have a great amount of faith or a little amount of faith, just the faith of a mustard seed. Now, unfortunately, little faith doesn't live a victorious life. And to be honest, not every Christian lives a victorious life. But if they've placed faith in Jesus, true faith, and they have received forgiveness in the righteousness of Christ, they will make it to the end. Remember, if the seed falls on good soil, some may only produce 30-fold, but they're still saved. Some 60. They've lived more of a victorious and a productive life. Some 100-fold. They've lived definitely lived a victorious and a productive Christian life, but all three of them are still Christians. And the goal would be that you wouldn't be little faith, though the most important thing is that you have faith. But hopefully you would be more of a victorious and productive believer. Okay. Then now Christian is going down the narrow path, right? As soon as he is saved and forgiven and given these gifts, the first thing he does is he sees this hill. And the narrow path is like going up this hill. And there's two guys that are with him. And one of the guys represents a Pharisee, and another guy represents the hypocrites. The Pharisees and the hypocrites. What did Jesus say about them? He was like, whoa, you guys are in trouble. They knew the law, but they had no faith. They were going to do it themselves. And when Pharisee and hypocrite looked up the hill of difficulty, what else did they see? They saw two other paths, and they were not, you didn't have to climb up. They were simply, it looked like they just went all the way around, right? And they were like, I'm taking the easy path. But what did the path do? It didn't go all the way around. It led them to destruction. What does the hill of difficulty represent for us? Yeah. What do you think specifically the hill of difficulty represents? Little bit. The hill of difficulty represents everything that hinders us from staying on the straight and narrow way. What sort of things hinder you? What sort of things hinder you from keeping on that straight and narrow? Your flesh, your sin habits, your idols. Yes, your fear of man. Yes, so all of these things, all of us have our own hills of difficulties. And we make them ourselves. And we sometimes have to climb up against and overcome all of our own hills of difficulties. But there is a narrow way that will allow you to get up and to get over them. And as Christian was, first of all, he was just going at it. The burden's off his back. He's running up the hill. Hill's getting harder. Next thing you know, he's on his hands and knees climbing up the hill. And he finally makes it up the hill, and he's like, And then he sees two guys running back, and they're going to run down the hill. And these guys, one was named Nervous, and the other was named Mistrust. And why were they running the other way? There were some what did they see? Two lions. And they're like, Christian's like, what are you doing? It's like, there's lions up there, and they're going to devour us. And so they didn't trust. And so they try to convince Christian to go back down. And Christian, this is one of those parts where he shouldn't have taken a nap, and he did take a nap. And what fell out of his new clothes when he took a nap? The scroll. Well, actually, it was in his hands because he was reading it and made him feel all good and warm. And he fell asleep and falls off. And then someone wakes him up and is like, you better get up that hill and get to the next place. And he starts going, and he forgot the scroll, and then he realized that. He go all the way back, and he's like, okay, for the third time, I went there, then I had to go back. I found it, and I'm going back again, and it's getting dark at night, and he's worried about these lions. And sure enough, he shouldn't have taken that long. He shouldn't have fallen asleep on the way, but he did. But then he finally made it to the Palace Beautiful. But he's got to get past the lions. And Christian is almost going to turn around and go back. But what happens? Yeah, a man named Watchful, he says, look closer. Yes, there are lions who want to devour you. And what does that represent? Satan, who roams around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But he's on a chain. I'm going to devour you, but there's a way, very straight way, right in between them, if you're willing to take it. And Watchful says, are you willing? This is part of the journey. Are you willing to make sure you go right through those lions that want to devour you? And it was so important that Watchful was there. He represents, anybody who know who Watchful represents? What's that? Uh-huh. Does anybody know who, anybody knew who Watchful represents? So the Bible gives an image of a person who would stand on the corner of the wall in the city, and he would yell out news. He was a teller of news. Does anybody know who that represents? A teller of news? It could be a pastor, or it could be anybody who is sharing the good news, right? The news of danger and the news of escape, right? So in essence, that's part of our role, is to be those watchful people, to say, danger ahead, here's the way through it. Danger, here's the way through it. And that's actually the job of an evangelist and the job of a preacher, right? So we're all preachers. I'm a pastor who also is a preacher, but we're all preachers because we're all supposed to be telling the news. And watchful, he tells the news. He was a preacher. And sure enough, Christian makes his way through to the Palace Beautiful, where the first thing that he does is he eats this wonderful meal. Now, what does the Palace Beautiful represent?
Particular Baptist Church.
Yep. You want to explain that, Ted?
Bunyan had such a high view of the church that this is how he described it, as an absolutely beautiful palace where you would have comfort and encouragement and restoration and feeding spiritually. It would meet your needs for community and love and discipline and encouragement. So for
Yeah.
Bunyan had a high view of the local church. It's absolutely vital for the Christian life.
Yeah. Yes. The Palace Beautiful is the church. And I just wish there were more Christians who saw the church like Bunyan did. Like Ted said, church was a beautiful place. Charles Spurgeon called it the dearest place on earth. Because this is where we find our communion. This is where we find our fellowship. This is where we are strengthened. This is where we celebrate suppers. What kind of suppers do we celebrate? The Lord's Supper. We celebrate the supper of Christ together. We're united together. And Christian, when he gets to the Palace Beautiful, has conversations with three individuals who represent loyalty to Christ, the wisdom of Christ, and the love of Christ. Loyalty to Christ, wisdom of Christ, the love of Christ. And it's one of the most strengthening points of Christian's journey. And it's also where Christian receives his armor. And you know, Bunyan is saying you can't do this alone. You're not going to make it through the narrow way without the church. It's just not going to happen. You need the strength and the assurance and the love and the protection and the care and the instruction that the Palace Beautiful provides. It's what keeps us on the straight and narrow path. Because when at church we receive instruction from God's Word, we receive fellowship from one another, we celebrate the Lord's meal together, and we are strengthened to go out and fight the spiritual battle. Because that's exactly what happens to Christian right after he leaves the Palace Beautiful. He has to pass down through the valley of humiliation, and then he takes on Satan. Now, why does he have to pass through the valley of humiliation before he takes on Satan? Why does the straight and narrow path take us through the valley of humiliation. Yes. Yeah, we need to feel the humiliation of our sin. What else? Yes, you cannot defeat Satan if you're not humble. Right? Because pride leads us to what? Destruction. The only way you can win the spiritual battle if you recognize how weak you are. It is when I'm weak, then I am strong. So we have to pass through the valley of humiliation in order to realize where our true strength comes from. And Pilgrim had to go through there, Christian had to go through there to humble himself, to become weak so he could become strong enough to defeat Apollyon. And then Christian learns that the pathway to heaven, there are victories, there are defeats. There are mountaintop experiences, and there are valleys. Because as soon as he defeats Satan, you'd think he'd be like, Rocky. Dun, 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 dun. As soon as he defeats Satan, and by heaven's help, his wounds are healed, he has to go through the valley of the shadow of death. Does anybody know what the valley of the shadow of death represents? Who wrote about the valley of the shadow of death? David, and there's one other prophet. Does anybody know? What prophet? Take a guess. I heard it. Jeremiah. Jeremiah, very good. Now, what was it when we think of David, when he was on the run, hiding in caves because King Saul wanted to kill him? And this kept going on and on and on. And what was it about Jeremiah that he got to the point where he would describe his life as though he were in the valley of death? What was happening with these two guys? They what? Mm-hmm. But spiritually, what were they feeling? What was David feeling? What was he experiencing? Fear? Yes. Yes. I think the main feeling that David had and that Jeremiah had is, I'm alone. God has left me alone. And that is one of the most difficult feelings you could ever have. I've been abandoned. And I don't even know if God's here with me. I don't even know if God's here with me. And many of the songs that David wrote are songs that we call lament psalms. And David is brokenhearted. And you can hear it in the songs. God, where are you? You've put me in this place. You've put me in this pit. I can smell hell. I can see Sheol, David would say. Because you remember, as Christian was having to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the one side, right next to him, was hell. And the other side was an abyss, a pit. And he's like, at any moment I could slip. David felt like that. Jeremiah was actually put into a pit. He was a prophet of God, and he was put into a pit. And he had to stay there, and he's like, he was just alone for a long, long time. And this sense of of being lonely and the sense of being weary is what Bunyan is talking about. Someone read Psalm 69 and verse 14. Psalm 69 and verse 14. Because we want to talk about how do we make it out of the valley of the shadow of death. Psalm 69 and 14. Got it? Read it out loud if you have it.
Deliver me from the mire, and do not let me sink. May I be delivered from my foes and from the deep waters.
So the psalmist is saying, David is saying, Lord, deliver me from this pit. Don't let me sink down into it. I need your help. And when you cry out to God as you're going through the valley of the shadow of death, what do you realize? What does Psalm 23 say? What's that? You're not alone. You're not alone. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. We have to go through the valley, but we're not alone. We're not alone. Because at some point in time, Christian realized he needed help, and so the Lord makes the light of day reveal the path for Christian to escape the valley of death. And he can do the same with us. And having escaped that on the narrow way, the Lord made Christian and faithful go through Vanity Fair. Okay, why didn't the Lord make the narrow path go around Vanity Fair? Why did they have to go through it? Yes. We got to, yes, very good. We have got to live in this world, but not of it. You can't escape Vanity Fair. You can't be like the monks tried to be and just hide themselves away from the world and devote themselves to piety, and they thought that was the way of living. No. Jesus, he prayed that his disciples would live in this world, but not of it. And he said to Christian and faithful, you got to go into Vanity Fair. Now don't take part of Vanity Fair, but you've got to go into it. And they became witnesses. Even though faithful ended up being a martyr and giving his life, if it weren't for their witness, hopeful never would have been saved. And so yes, we cannot avoid Vanity Fair, but neither do we have to be caught up into it, because we can choose 1 John chapter 2, do not be conformed, what? To this world, or the lusts of this world, lust of the eyes, right? Pride of life, the lust of the flesh. We don't have to love this world, even though we live in Vanity Fair. And so Raleigh and Wake County, it's Vanity Fair. It's all around us. We don't have to love it, but we do need to live in it, and live in it as pilgrims who are on a journey, right? It's not our home, but we can be ambassadors for Christ while we're here. And faithful was faithful, even though his life ended short. It was God's desire, and he made it to heaven. And Christian then is united with hopeful because of Vanity Fair, and they were able to escape the silver mine. And then, after they escaped the silver mine, the narrow way, led them to the river of the water of life. And there, at the river of the water of life, there were trees, and they were green, and their leaves never got brown. And there was fruit on the tree, and it never went bad. And the fruit would just be there all year, no matter what the seasons was. And what does that represent? What? It's kind of like that. It's a good picture of that. What does resting by that water and enjoying the fruit in season and out, does anybody know of a passage in the Bible? Very good. Let's go to Psalm 1. Psalm 1. Psalm 1. And in Psalm 1, which, by the way, Psalm 1 is both the introduction to the entire book of Songs, and it gives the theme. And interestingly enough, it's about a path. It's about two paths. The pathway of unrighteousness and the pathway of righteousness. And the first pathway is for the righteous. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. How blessed are you if you don't do that? And right in Pilgrim's Progress, Christian, he actually had to deal with this. Because at times, he allowed his walk, his journey, he stopped and listened to the counsel of the wicked. Remember how you do that on occasion? That was always a bad idea. And then at other times he would actually stand there amongst the sinners. And you know what? He even, this is bad, he even gave bad instruction. He did it to hopeful. He sat in the seat of the scoffers. And so Christian had to learn not to follow that path, but rather his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And here it is. And he will be like a tree planted by streams of water, which yield fruit in season and out, and the leaf doesn't wither, and whatever he does, he prospers. But the wicked are not like that. They're like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Do you see that? This was one of the guiding scriptures to help Bunyan write this whole story. There's a way for of the wicked, and they're going to perish. Even some of the wicked, they get to the very gates of heaven, right? And what happens to them? They're taken away to hell. And so the way of the wicked is always the way of perishing. The way of the righteous is the way that finally leads to heaven. And so for just a brief amount of time, a Christian and hopeful get to enjoy and rest there near the river of the water of life. But then they realize it's time to get on the straight and narrow way again. And as soon as they get on the straight and narrow way, it's following this beautiful river, and they can drink of the river, and everything's great. But then the narrow way diverges from the river and it becomes very hard and difficult. And then what does Christian do? He says to hopeful, he goes, hey, across the river, that looks like a pretty lush lawn. And it's following parallel to our path. You know what? Doesn't it just seem smart that we would hop off this path, because it's killing my feet, just cross the river and get on the lawn and just follow that path? And Hopeful's like, I don't think that's a good idea, because this is the path. Christian's like, come on. It's right there. It's right there. Easy enough. And he convinces them to do it. And that leads them down through darkness and rain and storm to the giant despair. And we talked about that story at Doubting Castle. And they had to eventually go through that very difficult experience. But you know, even after they escaped by the Lord's help, God provided for them another opportunity to be revived and refreshed along the way. So every time, right, along the way, difficulty, rest, difficulty, rest. This seems to be the life of the Christian, right? He doesn't give us more than we can handle, but when we are challenged, he provides the way out. That's our journey. And as difficult as Doubting Castle was, and they escaped, they got back on the narrow way, they ended up at the Delectable Mountains. And these mountains belong to who? Emmanuel. Right. And there, again, they could rest, and they were told, you can rest here and get refreshed. And so Christian, he asked the shepherds there at the Delectable Mountains, he said, can we see the celestial city from here? And they said, well, it depends. If you can look through our prism, you might be able to see it. And that again was depending on your faith. And then he says, oh, I think I see it. And then he asked the question, how much further is it to heaven? And here's the answer that was given. And we need to think about this. It's too far for any except those that will no doubt arrive there. How long will it take me to get to heaven? Will I be able to get there? Oh, it's too far for anyone. Oh, no, it's too far for you to get there. Unless you know you're going to get there. Am I going to make it to heaven? Oh, it's too far. No one can get there. Unless you know you're going to get there. What's Bunyan saying? It's too far for anyone. Unless you have no doubt you're going to get there. What's he saying? It's a matter of faith, right? It's a matter of faith. And who gets to decide when someone gets to heaven? It's the Lord. It's appointed. It's the Lord who decides. You just have to realize you ain't getting there on your own. But if you have no doubt you're going to get there, you'll get there. I love that concept. I think that's very helpful for us. Jesus was trying to explain this after the resurrection, and his disciples were still full of doubt. And they just said, you know what? I'm going to go. Peter says, I'm just going to go back and go fishing again. I don't know what else to do. I know how to fish. I know how to catch fish. Jesus shows up, helps them catch a bunch of fish. He's cooking breakfast for them. And he confronts Peter. And he says, do you love me now? Well, take care of my sheep then. And then he says to Peter this. He says, Peter, you're going to die crucified like I did. That's your fate. You will hang. And Peter looks at John and says to Jesus, what about him? And Jesus said to Peter, doesn't matter. If he lives until he just immediately ends up in heaven, what's that to you? It's too far, except for those who have no doubt they will arrive there. And we have to have faith that God's already determined our journey. He's already decided how difficult it's going to be. You just have to have no doubt you're going to make it. And there are some whose journey to heaven is a lot more difficult than yours. But there are some it's a whole lot less difficult than yours. That's not us to decide, right? That belongs to the Lord. So, Christian and hopeful, they enjoy rest there at the Delectable Mountains. And again, good shepherds, good pastors care for them and instruct them. And they give them a map. What does Christian fail to do? He fails to use the map. This, if I can vent for just a second as a pastor. Cut the tape, Chris. Can I speak for all pastors for a second? The good shepherds on the Delectable Mountains, they cared for Christian and hopeful. They instructed them and they gave them a map. And they still didn't use the map. And do you know that happens to us as pastors? As much as we care for our church members, as much as we love them, as much as we instruct them, and as much as we give them the map, they don't always follow it. They don't always follow it. And ironically, when their life gets difficult, they blame the pastors. They don't use the map, and they end up in all these problems and crises, and then they blame us, and we're like, gave you the map. What else can I do? And I think Bunyan, who was a pastor, he felt this. He felt this because so many people that he ministered to fell away. Didn't follow the map. And you know what's so discouraging is as much as the good shepherds tried to help them, all it took was one flatterer, and off Christian goes. One flatterer. I've seen that happen so many times. Where you're being faithful in teaching them what Christianity is. And now we know it's not always easy. But someone comes along and offers an easier path, or a church that's not going to deal with all of these hard issues. No, our church is not like that. You'll like our place of worship. deal with all these difficult issues. Or you know what? You don't need that. You don't even need church. You can do this on your own. It just takes one flatterer. And so many just turn. And even near the end of his journey, Christian got veered off by the flatterer. Now, initially, the guy looked like someone who was holy and someone who knew what he was talking about. He was dressed in white. But he deceived them. And Christian and Hopeful ended up where? In a trap. And again, Hopeful's like, I don't think we should do this. Christian's like, Thank God for the Hopefuls. But they end up caught in a net, right? And how do they get free from the net? God sends an angel down, and the angel does two things. First, cuts them loose from the snare. What's the second thing the angel did? Gave him a royal holy spanking. Yes, children, look at me. Sometimes you may get a spanking because your parents are angry, and that's not a good thing, but sometimes they give a spanking because you need it. Christian got a spanking from the Lord. Why would the angels spank them and beat them? And because the Lord disciplines those, what? Whom He loves. The Lord disciplines those that belong to Him. And the spanking, the beating, was a sign that the Lord loves Christian and Hopeful, loves them enough to discipline them. I mean, they're so close. They don't need to get off the track now. They're so close. And so they actually needed the discipline in order to return, because the angel said, didn't those good pastors give you a map? Yes. Did you look at it? No. Okay, turn around. Let me give you a reminder. You've been given the map, how to stay on the way. May this be a good reminder. And do you know that the Lord actually gave the church discipline? We call it church discipline. And it's a reminder for people who get off the path that now this is going to hurt, but this is going to be a forever reminder if you stay on the path. And sure enough, they got back on the path, and that it led them to the enchanted forest. And the enchanted forest was a place where, they got so sleepy. And the only way they could not fall asleep, because if they would have fallen asleep there, they'd be gone. How was the only way that they could get through the enchanted path? Anybody know? They talked to each other and encouraged each other, and they talked about good and godly things. Now, what would have happened if they'd have been alone? They would have fallen asleep. This was a time when they both needed each other. This was a time, if they had not had each other, they had fallen asleep and ended up in destruction. And they talked about good things and godly things. And Christian was talking to Hopeful, and they were even arguing over what's true, which is okay to do. They're debating the Bible and debating what truth is. That's a good thing, because they were doing it to encourage each other, and they were doing it to stay awake as iron sharpens iron. And then, sharing testimonies and all of the victories that they've had. And they were able to get through the enchanted path because they had each other. Well, that leads us to the last chapter, but we're going to break for lunch.